On behalf of the Tredegar Society and the Hill-Tucker Bar Association, it is my great honor to welcome you to the American Civil War Museum for this night with Dr. Jack Trammell. This series is brought to you in part by a generous contribution from the law firm of Hunton & Williams, LLP. Since its founding in Richmond in 1901, Hunton & Williams has grown to more than 800 attorneys in 19 offices in North America, Europe, and Asia, and represents clients across the full spectrum of industries that make up today's global economy. In addition, last year, every single lawyer at Hunton & Williams participated in pro bono service. As a firm, they contribute more than 50,000 hours each year to community service and charitable projects, including many hours of service to this museum. We thank them for their support of the museum and this speaker series. Although I'm tempted to just read it aloud, I commend to you the biography of Dr. Trammell in the handout that we put on your chair. What you would see if you read it is a very admirable portrait of familial virtue. He's got, with his wife, 7 children who he has raised on a family farm. You would see a model of academic, scientific truth-telling by a sociologist, trained with a PhD. You would see some very thoughtful thinking and erudition about what needs to happen in our country. He's written everything from textbooks for children in history and mathematics to published articles in sociological journals, to the book that inspired tonight's talk, which is called The Richmond Slave Trade, the Economic Backbone of the Old Dominion. But despite all of these accomplishments, which I think in a properly ordered society probably means that we all would have known who he was already, I suspect that a lot of you, for a lot of you and for me, that he came on your radar when he put aside all of those wonderful, productive, wholesome things to do and instead ran for Congress. Why would you do that? And furthermore, how on earth did he find an opponent who was also willing to leave aside what I imagine is a very pleasant and certainly a productive existence as a professor at Randolph-Macon? I suspect that we will see tonight a few hints or clues as to why he was willing to subject himself to the democratic process and why he thought it was important to be involved. And that's because he's going to be talking about a part of our history that is, I think, the most important thread that still shapes and indeed governs a lot of what happens in our country today. So, and furthermore, it's a subject that I think should be foremost in the minds of anyone who wants to get involved and shape where we're going to go in the future. So, with that, I would like you to please give a very warm welcome to Professor Jack Trammell.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's great to see everybody, and thank you to the wonderful organizations that have made tonight possible. I am really thrilled to be here to talk to you about this subject, and it's not an easy subject to talk about. The thread that was mentioned is a thread that involves a quest for social justice. It's a thread that involves the American experience, which is unique in the world and is sometimes difficult to understand. It's a thread that involves making peace with our past and embracing who we are, including the good and the bad. So, with that as a theme, which is also related to why I did run for office, which is that I believed if I were elected or even by running, I could further that process, that quest for justice, that thread for Americans to understand who we are and where we want to go. It was well worth the ride. And my opponent I just talked to the other day, he is staying just as busy as me up in Washington. So I wish him well. So a little bit about this project. It began a long time ago. I was writing a military history column for the Washington Times, and that was a fairly conservative newspaper, and I know that's a little unusual for a Democrat to be writing for a conservative newspaper, but I've always been fascinated by military history. I've been trained as a historian, taught history in the public schools, as well as a special educator. And one of my articles was a tour, a virtual tour of wartime Richmond during the Civil War. And in this article, you essentially traveled around the different parts of Richmond, and I described what you would see, the people you would encounter, the businesses you would see, the architecture, what the streets would look like, and so on. Part of that tour went into a little-known area down in the bottom where a street named Wall Street ran, and this was where the slave auction house businesses had gathered just below the Capitol area. And people who read this article were all fascinated by the one or two sentences that I had put in the story about this area of town. And my editor said, I'd like for you to write an article about the Richmond slave trade since people have expressed this interest. So, like the good, dutiful, freelance writer and researcher that I was, I did an article on the Richmond slave trade. And I called it the Wall Street of the Confederacy because the irony was immediately evident to me that there was a lot of commerce and important economic implications from this business, and it served the Confederate government, part of the economic backbone of the Confederacy. And so I entitled the article, The Wall Street of the Confederacy. To my surprise, after I'd written this article, my editor at the Times refused to run it. He said, this is just far too disturbing for our readership. And I was very upset by that, but as fate would have it, another editor came along who was a lot more radical and happened to be African American, and he said, what projects do you have lying around here, Jack, that we haven't run with? And I said, well, there's this one that your predecessor said would never run. And he took a look at it and he said, we're running this next week. And it came out. And it's the only time in my writing career that I've received death threats and all kinds of feedback that I didn't anticipate getting. And my editor told me, he said, don't be nervous about this. What it indicates is that you've struck a nerve, that you have touched on something that's very difficult for Americans, for people to talk about, to study, to read about, and I think we've done something great by bringing this out. Well, immediately some book offers came about, and the History Press offered to do a book on this, and I started work on it. And it became a project that I never expected to make any money from, and if you've ever done freelance writing, you'll take some meaning from this, because a lot of times I would write to try to make a little extra money. This is a job that never had any money written on it. It became a job that consumed me because there was a story I uncovered that had never been told, or at least it had not been told as accurately and as fully as it should have been. And it was a story that really, really resonated for Richmonders, especially because of the difficulty of trying to reconcile the past. So there are some unique things about this, a few of them that I'll just list for you briefly. Number one, there is just overwhelming scholarship about slavery. There are thousands of books, thousands of articles, thousands of people who have a lot more expertise than I do in the history and the outline of U.S. slavery. But if you look specifically at the Richmond Slave Trade, the way the industry worked here, and this was its, even though New Orleans was bigger in numbers, Richmond was the capital, the heart and soul of the economic part of slavery, and I'll explain more about that. The scholarship on the Richmond slave trade is still underwhelming, and my book is far from the last word on that. Another unique aspect of this I discovered is, and I'm not the first one, but it was a revelation to me, was that slavery has been around for thousands of years, but it never was coupled with capitalism. The surplus value of labor will take on a new meaning for you if you think about slavery and capitalism going together. And as I read and researched and went through the records, and I actually physically traced money from a sale that took place on Wall Street to the deposit that was made in Richmond, to the transfer that was made from Richmond to New York City, to the transfer that was made from New York City to finance the steel mill in Cleveland, Ohio, I started to understand something, that this wasn't just a Southern problem. This was an American problem, and that this was a huge economic phenomenon that we just simply had not appreciated. We built America on the backs of slavery. And I'll talk a little more about that, but slavery and capitalism are not peanut butter and chocolate. They are a very strange two things to put together, and the abstractions that come out of that are very disturbing. In some ways, they're only analogous to huge events like the Holocaust, and things like this that we have a hard time understanding how capitalism, corporations, and industry can go along with something so horrific and wide scale. It's a story that ended up involving collusion. Richmonders and Virginians and Southerners and Americans in general have trouble understanding who to blame for slavery. It's been very easy to blame the slave holders, but as I researched this story, I found that it was a story of collusion. It was a story that all Americans went along with, and there was an abolition movement, and we know about that and its history, and those people were brave, and that was commendable. But boy, a lot of Americans, both North and South, benefited from the system economically and were basically indifferent at best. It's a story that's filled with historiography and challenges for the researcher as well. I admire a man named Michel Foucault, who is a French philosopher, a French academic, and he has used the terms archaeology and genealogy to talk about how we understand history and how we understand how power works. And I love those terms because I literally was engaging in a form of archaeology where I was uncovering ideas and threads of how this system worked and connecting them up like a family tree. What does it mean, for example, that our founding fathers hijacked the rhetoric of slavery to describe our relationship to Great Britain, yet at the same time ignored the system of slavery in their own 13 colonies and in the new republic? So Foucault's way of explaining that is to use genealogy, a way of tracing where ideas come from. And I'll give you an example of that in just a little bit that has to do with the notion of black or white. So this was quite an experience, and it also showcased for me history as performance. And by that, I mean that there's an art to dealing with a topic that is so difficult to wrap your hands around. I met many, many people who are still very angry about many aspects of this story. And a lot of what I talk about is only talked about with the respectful understanding that this is still very difficult for us on a lot of levels, given where we are as a nation today. So there's been overwhelming interest in this topic. When I ran for Congress, you become a celebrity overnight, but the truth is a lot of people had already known me as a result of this book. I did not anticipate that it was going to be the best-selling of all the books that I'd ever written, and that doesn't mean much if you look at my other book sales. When you're an academic, you're not basing your success on the number of books you sell. A runaway bestseller for an academic is 1,000 books, so. But I've been overwhelmed by the interest. People around the country, even in other countries, contact me out of the blue and say, I have this, or I have these records, or I have a family diary that has this, and people are very interested in the story finally coming out. So one bit of news for you tonight is that a sequel is on the way, and it's in part because I did a lot of research for this book, but I have an avalanche, boxes of stuff that have come to me through various sources since then. So it's a story that's ongoing. But it's also shown me that history is recoverable, that there is an archaeology. You can dig up the truth and find out what's there. I have heard people talk about the library at Alexandria. Do you know the famous story that it was burnt and all the ancient manuscripts of the old world were lost? And people lament to this day the burning of the library at Alexandria. And so there's this notion that lost history is a tragedy, that we can never find it again. This project has actually shown me the opposite, that we can recover a lot of our history. We have a lot of potential there to bring the past alive and to have meaning from it that can serve us today. So some of the other lessons that I learned are, one important thing was that there is this notion of black and white that we make such a big deal of today did not exist in America when America began. That was simply not the way people thought of each other. In the 17th century, there were even black plantation owners who owned their own black slaves. And so black and white was not an identity that people associated with. Instead, in those days, people focused on Christian versus non-Christian. They focused on free or not free, which was not exactly the same thing as slave or non-slave, because indenture was like slavery in some ways, and there were slaves who were treated like indentures and indentures who were treated like slaves. So it was free or not free that were the categories people understood. The first Africans on Virginia soil were probably Christian, they were probably indentured servants, and they were probably released later, which means that the history of slavery in Virginia is a history that evolves. It evolves over time as there is legislation in the House of Burgesses. It evolves over time as there are judges who make decisions about property disputes and indenture disputes. And it's only by about 1700 that you really see slavery as an institution in Virginia and in the South codified and starting to become what we later think of it as in the antebellum era. I found out that there's a power to semantics. The idea of slavery and freedom was hijacked by men in powerful positions. They called England a land of slavery, and that we were the slaves and our owners. It was time for us to throw off our shackles. And how ironic was that when we were codifying slavery of blacks ourselves? So this is a very complicated history to uncover. When you were on Wall Street, when you were going to be sold at auction, which meant that after the international slave trade was banned, you were going to be probably sent somewhere else. Virginia was a key focal point, the market here for slaves to be sent further south. You were often simply recorded by a first name or a descriptor. In some cases, you didn't even get a name. You were just the tall one with long hair or things like this. And if you did get a last name, you got the last name of your owner. And if you think about the Western tradition, which comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, what was one of the most powerful tools given to man? The ability to use language and to name things. So to take away the ability to name people is something that comes through in these records. One of the most dehumanizing elements was you took away their name. They literally became a commodity. Some things that I learned about history. I learned that nothing is chiseled in stone, like Mel Brooks in The History of the World. Have you ever seen? It's not like that. This was truly an American experience. There are no other real good analogies in world history or in other places to compare what happened here. And what's interesting and sad is that people had choices. It was not predestined. There were intersections, there were stop signs, there were places where the road forked, and people made decisions, and that's why we ended up where we did. By 1860, though, you might imagine, those choices were so constricted that the war was inevitable. One of the things that came out of the book for me is I don't think that slavery would have ended easily without a war. There was too much profit and economic tendrils attached to it. Also, I found that people's attitudes were not static. There is no such thing as the monolithic South. There were people in the South who hated slavery. There were people in the South who were indifferent to it. There were people who benefited from it. There were people who saw nothing wrong with it. The same thing was true of Americans in general. And so it's very hard to generalize about Americans of that time and what they thought about slavery. But what we can know is how much they economically benefited from it. That we can't dispute. There are complexities to this that are just confounding to logic. There is I went through the letters of one slave owner who wrote a letter, and in the same letter, he brags of how he beat one of his slaves for misbehaving. And in the same letter, later on, he talks of a young slave boy, an endearing son, saying he's going to set him up for life in the same way that he set his own son up. How do we reconcile that? How do we make sense of that in our 21st century mindset? So this project showed me that it's really difficult to impress our nowness on the thenness that people lived in and to really understand what slavery was like. Now, this book is also about the overwhelming power of economics. If you read the book, you'll get a chance to see that this was a phenomenal thing. Slavery actually became commodified, which means that they were selling futures on labor of slaves before they were even doing the work, and they were speculating on the future value of that labor. We have here in Richmond, right here at Tredegar even, we have slaves who were hired out to work in industry, and their owners begin lobbying for them to have better treatment and better rights, shorter working hours, better medical attention. We were headed, had the war not come, toward a very strange situation where African slaves who worked in industry were headed toward unionization. A very strange story. So again, the American story is unique, and it was right here in Richmond where it was centered. It was a speculative system, and so this wild speculation on the value of slave labor meant that there could be booms and busts in the market, and you can track that pretty easily through the historical record. By the time of the Civil War, the value of slaves had risen to the point where it was 3 to 4 times the value of the whole gross domestic product. So if you thought the North was going to buy out the South, think again. There wasn't enough money printed in the globe to buy out slavery at that point. The only way it was going to end was in fire and destruction. I learned, of course, that the past still has a lot of pain associated with it. As I went around Richmond, I've gone along the slave trail numerous times. I've met with people who have chronicled the history of slavery in Virginia and in Richmond and the slave trade here. And it's very clear to me that this is something that connects up to very difficult conversations today. So more than anything, this book was intended to be a dialogue, a way for us to talk about this and to try to bring some healing and some reconciliation and some understanding. It also was about myth-busting. Slavery was not the primary cause of the Civil War. I know it's heresy for me to say that, but hear me out. It should be more specific. The economics of slavery was the cause of the war. Now it's ironic that you see Confederate currency with vignettes of slaves on there, and it's worth 10 times the face value of what the Confederate money was worth then. Another irony in a capitalist culture, these are tags that identified individual slaves at auction, and now they're collected like coins and sold on eBay. We live in a strange world where capitalism and human misery get mixed together. Slavery, another myth, is that this is just a more sophisticated form of slavery like we've always seen in world history. And I hope I've helped convince you a little bit tonight, no, this wasn't slavery in ancient Greece. This was a different animal, and it involved economics far beyond individual slave owners. Some of the strangest anecdotes that come out of this are, for example, a Lutheran congregation in the Shenandoah Valley whose members were predisposed to be against slavery, decided to invest in buying slaves nonetheless, because it was the best return on their dollar they could get for the church's endowment, if you will. And so they rented those slaves out, and they used the proceeds from the rents to pay the pastor's salary. And they applauded themselves on their ingenuity for having a way to pay the preacher's salary without having to raise money or give more in the offering plate. And yet, this was a Lutheran congregation where many members were actually against slavery. So again, what a strange story that we should think this was a monolithic kind of story, a one-size-fits-all kind of story. It's a myth that the North was not involved in the slave trade, an absolute myth. And many places like Brown University and other places have apologized for their role in benefiting from the slave trade and from slave trafficking. So one article that I've written that will be in this new book is trying to examine why Southern slave traders exclusively almost used Northern banks. They hardly ever put their money in Southern banks. So they did all their business here, but they put all their money in the banks in the North. And I won't go off on a tangent to tell you why that is, but there's just many tendrils to this story. But the myth busting is that the North had nothing to do with slavery. That's just not true. Another myth, slavery would have died out if you just left it alone. If we've got an industry that's 3 to 4 times the GDP, it's not going to die out on its own. That's not the way capitalism works. They were still selling and trading on Wall Street almost to the time the Union came in. And one of the sad stories is Lumpkin trying to get out of town with his last few slaves chained together, and the Confederate soldiers wouldn't let him get on the train. But that business was going strong right until the end. Another myth I mentioned was that the South could have been bought out. That just simply couldn't have happened. That was not realistic. Another myth is that the war in the South was fought to preserve slavery. But interestingly enough, slaves during the war were gaining rights left and right, and they were even offered freedom to fight for the Confederate Army. Here in the city of Richmond, citizens complained because slaves were allowed to run around freely and unsupervised, and they thought this was going to cause a lot of mischief. But it was inevitable. Regardless of the outcome of the war, slavery would have never been the same. So my final thought will be on the difficulty of the metaphor for Wall Street, because obviously, since Wall Street was where all this trade took place, a few blocks southeast, if I've got my direction right from here. When I went to the publisher, this was entitled The Wall Street of the Confederacy. And the CEO of the publisher, or a high-ranking person at the publisher, said, "We can't call it that. We don't want people to mix it up with what's happened on Wall Street or somehow associate that with what's going on Wall Street now." And my response was, that's exactly why it should be called that, because that's exactly what the story is. It's a story of money perpetrating a system that's evil and unfair. And ultimately, you can see the publisher won that battle, and we ended up calling it the Richmond Slave Trade, the economic backbone of the Old Dominion. So one of the things that was advertised tonight was the last days of Richmond. So had the war not ended, when it did, slaves would have continued to gain rights, even in the South. Had the war not gone the way it did, it probably would have changed the economic and prosperity prospects of America to become a superpower. One thing that the end of slavery did do in 1865, which people don't give enough credit to, is it reshaped American wage structures. And it also did facilitate the growth of labor unions. It impacted disability payments and rehabilitation programs for vets. And it actually shook the American foundation, economic foundation, to the core. And this is something that has not been written widely about. It's just assumed that with the end of slavery, we moved on to the next phase of American life. But this economic blood, this money, was so intertwined in the American experience and in the American economy that it shook things up for decades to come. It would not have ended without fire, destruction, and war. And so on some level, we should be grateful that it ended the way it did. So I know some folks might have questions and want to discuss some things. And so I will stop there, and I welcome your comments or questions. And again, I know this is not the end-all be-all on this. It was just an opening conversation, and I hope it's one that will continue to be a dialogue that we can appreciate all over, but especially right here in Richmond. So thank you. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. At the beginning, you indicated that people were very angry at you, you were getting death threats. What is it they were so angry about that you wrote in the book? And the second question is, you also indicated that slavery would have gone on without the war. If there had not been a war, when do you believe slavery would have ended, and why would it have ended in the United States?
Okay, for question number one, the article in the Washington Times upset people because it portrayed the slave trade in a radically economic way, comparing the value of a slave to a $50,000 Escalade SUV. It used metaphors and descriptors that made it real to people in a way that was uncomfortable to them. And that was in part a choice on my part to try to get people to pay attention, but it inadvertently also upset people. Now, the book has been through editing and is not like the article. You could probably look the article up and see, but I was surprised myself. I didn't expect that. I was converting the economics of 1860 to the economics of 2000, and the numbers just blew me out of the water, and apparently they just made people mad. And I got two different kinds of negative feedback about it. One saying that I was a darn Yankee writing about Southern things that I had no business writing about. And the other kind was that I was pulling the scab off of something that needed to just be left alone. Those were the kind of things that people were saying, only they were saying them in ways that I won't repeat. Part two, I think international pressure was already growing. I think if we had truly been on the path to try to become a superpower, slavery would have stood in the way, and it would have had to have been gradually dismantled. And that was already happening before the war and during the war, and so the model for how it would have happened you can look at in the way that slavery was kind of undone by the Confederates during their 4 years in power. And that process probably would have continued had there not been a war, only it would have looked a little different, having less of a regional flavor. It would have been fought in Washington instead of in Richmond. But it's hard to imagine any way but fire, destruction, and just we're going to just have to take a big step here and just get rid of it. In some ways, that seems like the only way it could have happened.
So when do you think it would have ended?
I think it would have had to have by, the 1880s. I mean, the world was changing too much, and there would have just been tremendous pressure. And I think that the abolition movement would have gained steam even in the South at a certain point. Yes? I think some comparisons can be made, except that Russia did not have the economic explosion, and capitalism did not take Russia and propel it into superpower status. That experience in America began in the 1830s and 40s with the explosion of infrastructure and capitalist ventures that were fueled by the money generated in part by slavery. And in Russia, there were a couple of those key ingredients missing, and so it's not quite analogous, although it's closer than some other things that I can think of. And so, again, from my perspective, this is really uniquely American in some ways. Yes.
What percent of the public in Richmond was dead set, hated, couldn't stand slavery? Just your best guesstimate.
In what year?
Totally against the 1860s. Not now.
Yeah, well, it would change over time. For 400 years, that would be a different answer. But in 1860, it was a very small percentage, but it was a sizable percentage. I would guess 5 to 10%. There were Quakers in town, for example, who were dead set against slavery, and they pretty much kept their mouths closed, but they were, in their personal writings and in their personal conversations, were dead set against it. And it wouldn't end soon enough as far as they were concerned. There were prominent Richmonders like Elizabeth Van Lew, who, at their own peril, spoke out against the evils of slavery. And the Van Lew Mansion in Richmond was raised as a result after the war as sort of a symbolic punishment in some ways for her standing up for that. Grant rewarded her, President Grant, for her anti-slavery work. But so you were anti-slavery in Richmond at your own peril before the war and during the war.
Any of your studies show the brain drain that Virginia had because of that? Were there any left of the Civil War free blacks in Virginia after that?
Yes. Enforcement of that was not uniform, and the insidious thing is that other states had reciprocal agreements. So, for example, it was either Maryland or North Carolina or both that said if any Virginia free blacks come here, we automatically sell them back into slavery. So Virginia's passed a law that says if you're a free black, you have to leave. And North Carolina's passed one that says if you show up here, we sell you back into slavery. What are you going to do? Now, obviously, those were not uniformly enforced, or there wouldn't have been any free blacks in Virginia at all. But by the Civil War, there's a pretty sizable free black population in Richmond, perhaps as many as 5 to 10,000 people, and that becomes part of the heart of the Richmond that we know after the war, and those free blacks did in fact help the transition for a lot of recently freed blacks after the war. So even in 1860, there was a very sizable free black population right here in town. So in spite of some of those laws, the free black population never was drained from Virginia. Those laws, in retrospect, seem more of a means of social control and arbitrary justice than an effective tool to actually remove all free blacks.
Thank you.
Thank you.